Before blankets were thick and homes were warm, the cold was not something you escaped. It was something you lived beside. For thousands of winters, people found quiet ways to keep breathing through the frost, each day a small victory against the ice. Tonight, let's step back into those frozen mornings and silent nights and see how the earliest humans learned to endure the chill. The first breath of winter in the ancient world did not arrive with a sudden, howling storm, nor with the kind of ice-crusted mornings we might imagine today. It came gradually, almost politely, as if it were testing the patience of those who lived under open skies. The air would shift first, just enough for a hunter to notice that his fingers took longer to warm after a morning drink from the stream. The grass, still green but softer in color, would bend under the weight of dew. That refused to lift, and the wind, that quiet messenger from the north, would carry with it the faintest scent of snow, though snow itself might still be weeks away. For the people of these early times, such signs were not just seasonal curiosities. They were warnings and reminders, part of an ancient language spoken between earth and humankind. To ignore them was to court hunger, sickness, or worse. And so, each subtle change in the landscape was met with quiet adjustments. Fires were coaxed to burn longer in the evenings. Wood was gathered not in small armfuls but in towering piles, and the skins from recent hunts were cleaned more carefully, soft with bone tools, and hung in the wind to dry. There was no calendar pinned to a wall, no written date that told them winter was near. Only the slow, deliberate rhythm of the land itself died at night. The first true chill would settle in the low places. Families, bound by the warmth of shared breath and body, would huddle together inside shelters built from whatever the land could give them. In the forests, these shelters might be framed with branches and covered in bark or layers of woven reeds. In the open plains, they might be dug partly into the ground, the earth itself serving as insulation. In colder northern reaches where trees thinned and snow came early, stone might form the base of a home, with a roof made of sod and animal hides stretched tight. However humble or rough these structures seemed, they were the thin line between life and death, a wall sometimes only a hand's thickness holding back the cold. The fire was the center of this world. Even a small flame meant more than heat. It meant survival. Ancient fires were not casually lit each morning from scratch. They were nurtured, preserved, and guarded. An ember from the previous night, buried deep in ash to keep it alive, could be coaxed back to life with gentle breath and dry tinder. If a fire went out completely, someone, often the swiftest young member of the group, might have to travel miles to another camp to bring back a burning branch. This, too, was part of the unspoken pact with winter. Never take fire for granted. Food, too, took on a different character as the cold season approached. Fresh berries and greens gave way to dried meat, smoked fish, and roots dug from the earth before the ground froze solid. The gathering and storing of food was done with quiet determination. There was no sense of feast or celebration in this. Work only the steady, patient knowledge that every mouthful saved now would be needed later. Even the youngest children would take part, helping to string slices of meat for drying, or to sort nuts from shells, their small fingers better suited. For certain delicate tasks, the cold did not come only from the air. It seeped from the ground, from the stones, from the slow fade of sunlight itself. And so the ancient people learned to carry warmth with them, not just in the heavy cloaks they wore, but in the way they lived close to one another, in the way they timed their movements to the sun, in the way they measured each not by hours, but by the rise and fall of heat. There was no war with the cold, no thought of conquering it. Winter was too vast, too patient to be defeated. Instead, there was a kind of quiet partnership. The people would give it respect, and in return they would endure. And so, as the last leaves loosened from the trees, as the streams began to slow under the touch of frost, and as the stars seemed sharper and more numerous in the night sky, the people gathered closer. Their voices dropped to murmurs, their movements became deliberate, and their thoughts turned inward. Winter was coming not as an enemy, but as a long, silent guest, one that would stay until the earth itself decided to awaken again. In the heart of winter, when even the air inside a shelter could bite at the skin, the hours of darkness stretched endlessly. To sleep through such nights was not a simple matter of closing one's eyes. It was an act of survival, a quiet negotiation between body, clothing, and the cold world outside. Ancient people learned with patience and trial how to make the sleeping hours a continuation of warmth rather than a surrender to the frost. The first rule was simple. No one slept alone unless there was no other choice. Heat, like stories, was best shared. Families, and sometimes entire small communities, slept together in tightly packed arrangements, forming human clusters beneath the same coverings. Children nestled between elders, their smaller bodies drawing on the steadier heat of adults. The closeness served more than one purpose. It was a comfort against the long dark, a reassurance that others were breathing nearby, that life continued. Through the cold, sleeping spaces themselves were crafted as carefully as clothing. In some northern shelters, beds were built into the walls, recessed and lined with furs. These alcoves trapped warmth in a way that open spaces could not, creating small pockets of shelter within shelter. In other regions, raised platforms kept sleepers above the chill of the earth or floor, away from the damp and the creeping cold that seeped upward during the night. Layering was just as important here as it was in clothing. Bedding began with insulating layers beneath the sleeper-thick mats of straw, reed, or dried moss. These were surprisingly effective, catching and holding heat from the body above while keeping the cold ground at bay. Over this came furs, woolen blankets, and hides, each layer heavier than the last. The thickest coverings were often placed on top, their weight pressing down like a shield, sealing in the warmth. For those living in particularly severe climates, sleeping arrangements could border on ingenious. In certain Arctic traditions, Snow houses or earthen shelters were built with a single raised sleeping bench carved into the wall, covered in thick animal skins. Here the body's warmth was concentrated, the small enclosed space amplifying every degree of heat. In other places, heated stones wrapped in cloth were placed near the feet before sleeping, their warmth slowly fading over the hours, but lasting just long enough to ease the deepest part of the cold. Some communities relied on fire's residual. Heat without keeping flames burning all night too risky when sleeping near flammable materials. Instead, fires were stoked in the evening, their heat absorbed into the walls, stones or clay beds, which would radiate a slow, steady warmth through the first part of the night. In well-designed shelters, smoke from the day's fire lingered, faintly, adding a subtle layer of insulation to the air. There was also the practice of sleeping in clothing, not the same clothing worn for daily tasks, but a separate set kept dry and warm. This was crucial in wet climates where even a little dampness could rob heat faster than the cold itself. Wool, linen, and fur all served well for this purpose, and garments were often loosened rather than removed, allowing for ease of breathing, while still retaining body heat. Position mattered, too. Ancient sleepers instinctively curled into positions that minimized heat loss, knees drawn toward the chest, arms tucked close, heads covered. In group settings, people often arranged themselves in alternating directions so that one person's feet were near another's torso, spreading heat more evenly. And in the smallest, coldest shelters, it was not unusual to see everyone wrapped in a single vast covering, a living bundle beneath a mound of furs. Even the sounds of night carried warmth of their own, the quiet rustle of a shared blanket shifting, the slow breathing of others, the occasional murmur in sleep. Outside, the wind might scrape against the roof, the snow might hiss against the walls, but inside, wrapped in the thick quiet of communal rest, the cold seemed farther away. In the long months of winter, these nights shaped bonds as surely as the days of work. Children would remember the particular feel of the fur their mother pulled over them, the scratch of wool against the cheek, the way the air inside the bedding always seemed to carry the faint scent of wood smoke. And elders waking briefly in the dark would listen to the deep, even breathing around them, and know that for now everyone was safe. To sleep in winter was not merely to pass the time until morning. It was an art of preparation, a layering of people, materials, and memories. With the right bedding, the right closeness, and the right care, even the coldest night could be endured, and morning would find the sleepers ready once more to face the frost. In the coldest seasons of the ancient world, a home was more than shelter from the wind. It was a container for heat, a vessel in which warmth was gathered, stored, and slowly released. Fire was the heart of this system, but the ways it was nurtured and directed differed from place to place, shaped by local materials, traditions, and climate. Over generations, people learned that heat could be guided, preserved, and even multiplied with clever design, turning the simplest of structures into havens of comfort. The most basic and universal heating method was the central hearth. At its simplest, it was little more than a shallow pit dug into the ground, lined with stones to hold the fire and prevent it from spreading. Yet even here there was refinement, stones chosen for their ability to retain heat, arranged to create a basin that both contained the coals and reflected warmth outward. A well-fed hearth radiated not just direct heat, but also a deep, slow warmth from its stones long after the flames had died down. Some cultures built hearths slightly below the floor level. The idea was simple heat rises, and by placing the fire lower, the warmth could flow upward, surrounding those sitting or sleeping above. In certain mountain regions, hearth pits were dug so deep that their heat seemed to rise from the very earth, blending the fire's warmth with the natural insulation of the soil. Chimneys, as we think of them today, were rare in the ancient world, but there were many ways to control smoke while keeping heat. In some cases, smoke was allowed to linger under the roof, where it not only preserved the wooden beams, but also created a warmer upper layer of air. In other cases, smoke holes or vents were placed high enough to let fumes escape while trapping. Most of the heat below dot in colder regions of Eurasia. One of the most remarkable heating systems was the hypocaust, an underfloor heating method used by the Romans and earlier cultures they influenced. The principle was elegant. A fire was built in a furnace outside or at the edge of the living space, and the hot air was channeled through hollow spaces beneath the floor. The floor itself, often made of stone or tile, would grow warm to the touch, radiating steady heat upward. In bathhouses, this system made entire rooms comfortably warm, even on the chillest days, and though complex to build, the idea endured for centuries. Elsewhere, simpler underfloor methods appeared. In some steppe and forest cultures, long trenches were dug beneath sleeping platforms or benches, and fires were lit at one end. The hot air would drift through these channels before escaping, heating the floor above. Even without elaborate masonry, the result was a more evenly warmed interior. Walls, too, could play a role in heating. In certain stone-built homes, especially in regions where volcanic rock was available, the walls themselves became heat reservoirs. Fires built against them during the day would cause the stones to absorb warmth, which would then slowly release into the room overnight. In wood-rich areas, thick log walls did much the same, though their heat retention was less than that of stone. Another ingenious method was the use of enclosed stove stone or clay, structures built to contain a fire entirely within. The fire's heat would warm the surrounding mass of the stove, which could stay warm for many hours after the flames had gone out. The Russian stove and similar designs in northern Europe became central not just for heating, but for cooking and even sleeping, as platforms or benches were built alongside or above them to take advantage of the stored warmth. In more nomadic cultures, portability was key. Large, immovable stoves were impractical, so heating was often combined with cooking in the form of small, controlled fires placed in well-ventilated tents. The design of the tent itself, such as the conical shape of a yurt or tipi, helped direct warm air downward, while hides or felt walls trapped the heat. The central fire could be banked at night, covered with ash to smolder until morning, when it could be quickly rekindled. The materials of the home itself also mattered greatly. Earth was one of the oldest insulating materials. Dugout shelters, partially or entirely sunk into the ground, used the steady temperature of the soil to buffer against both extreme cold and heat. Thick turf walls, layered with grass and soil, could hold warmth remarkably well, and when combined with a small hearth inside, such homes became unexpectedly snug. Even snow, paradoxically, was a superb insulator. In Arctic regions, igloos were heated with nothing more than body heat, oil lamps, and the warmth of cooking. The snow walls trapped the heat so effectively that the temperature inside could be dozens of degrees warmer than the air outside. The smooth, curved interior surfaces reflected warmth evenly, creating a surprising comfort within the frozen landscape. But perhaps the most subtle heating method of all was the careful arrangement of space. Warmth was not wasted on rooms that were not in use. Doors were placed to block prevailing winds. Sleeping areas were kept in smaller enclosed corners, and draft-blocking curtains or animal hides were hung in passageways. Heat, like water, flowed where it was directed, and ancient builders understood how to guide it. As the day ended and the hearth burned low, the house would hold its gathered heat like a slow-beating heart. Families would settle close, the walls quietly radiating the day's stored warmth, the floor still holding the memory of fire. Outside, the cold might sharpen into crystal silence, but within there was a steady, quiet breath of heat, a companion through the long winter night. When the earth lay hard and still beneath the snow, and the rivers slowed under a thin skin of ice, the warmth that kept people alive was not only in their shelters or clothing, it was also in their food. Eating in winter was less about taste than about survival, yet over time people learned to weave comfort into necessity. In the months when hunting grew harder and plants hid away under frost, the ability to store, preserve, and prepare food was as vital as a fire in the hearth. For ancient communities, the year's rhythm always bent toward this moment. Spring and summer were seasons of gathering and growth, but they were also a time of quiet preparation, when each harvest, each hunt, and each forage was measured not only for the present, but for the long stretch of winter ahead. The first skill was knowing what would keep. Grains, nuts, dried fruits, salted meat, and aged cheeses could be stored for months if protected from dampness and pests. Each had its place in the careful architecture of winter survival. Storage spaces were almost as important as the food itself. In some regions, people dug deep cellars into the earth, where the ground's constant coolness acted as nature's refrigerator. In colder climates, storage pits were lined with stone and sealed with snow and ice, turning them into ancient freezers. Above ground, granaries raised on stilts kept rodents away, their walls sealed tight against moisture. In more temperate zones, clay jars sealed with wax or animal fat preserved oil, honey, and other essentials. Preservation methods varied across the world, but were united by one principle: take what is perishable and make it endure. Meat could be smoked slowly over a low fire, the fragrant wood adding both flavor and longevity. Fish were salted until they glistened white, then hung to dry in the cold air. Fruits were sliced thin and left to dry in the sun or over gentle heat, becoming leathery strips that could last well into the new year. Grain was ground and baked into dense, dry loaves that, while far from fresh, could be softened in broth, or eaten with cheese in some places. The arrival of winter brought a shift toward heavier foods, meals that lingered in the stomach and fueled the body's fight against the cold. Thick stews of meat and root vegetables simmered slowly over the fire, filling the air with steam and scent. In more barren regions, even the humblest soup made from dried legumes and a pinch of herbs was treasured for the way it spread warmth from the inside out. Eating together was as much a defense against the cold as sleeping together had been. Communal meals kept people near the fire, their bodies adding to the collective heat. Large cooking pots allowed for efficiency, one vessel feeding many, with fewer resources wasted. In some cultures, the pot was never truly emptied. Each day's stew was built upon what was left from the day before, creating a deep, layered flavor that carried the memory of meals past. Certain foods carried a symbolic weight in winter. A carefully guarded jar of honey might be opened during a festival, its sweetness a reminder that life held joys beyond survival. A piece of dried fruit saved for a child was not merely food, but a gesture of hope. Even in the most austere conditions, people found ways to make eating more than a matter of fuel. It was a reminder of connection, of shared labor and shared reward. Herbs and spices, where available, were valued not only for taste, but for their warming qualities. Ginger, garlic, and pepper could stir the blood and brighten the mood. In some places, fermented drinks offered both calories and comfort, their slow warmth easing the deep cold of the evenings. And when fresh food was scarce, sprouting stored. Seeds indoors provided a small but welcome touch of green in the white and brown world outside. Children, growing up in such winters, learned early the value of a full storage room. They could recall the sound of dried beans being poured into a pot, the crackle of salted meat on the hearth, the sharp scent of smoke in the food that would last until spring. For the elders, each winter meal was proof of foresight and cooperation, a living link between the harvest's abundance and the season's scarcity. In the end, food in winter was not just sustenance, it was stored sunlight, harvested in warm months and kept safe for the cold ones. Each bite carried the memory of green fields, of running water, of summer's easy days. And in the deep stillness of winter nights, when the wind curled against the walls and frost grew in delicate ferns, on the windows, the heat from a shared bowl of stew could be as precious as the heat from the fire. Long before the invention of heated homes and insulated fabrics, warmth was often earned, not simply kept. For ancient people, the cold was not merely an outside condition. It was a constant, pressing presence that followed them into their shelters, breathed into their sleep, and sat heavy in their bones. To endure, they had to keep moving. Even in the deep heart of winter, when the landscape seemed still and lifeless, human life stirred in slow, purposeful rhythms. That movement was more than a task, it was a strategy. In the biting mornings, when frost clung to every surface and the breath hung like pale clouds in the air, people would rise and begin the work that warmed them from within. Chopping wood was one of the most vital acts. The steady swing of an axe, the thud of the blade biting into frozen timber, the crack and splinter of wood giving way. This was not only labor, but heat in motion. By the time a pile of logs was stacked near the fire, the blood was running quick and strong, and the body was ready to face the day. Animal care demanded movement, too. Livestock had to be fed, watered, and sometimes led to sheltered grazing or rotated between pens. Breaking ice on water troughs or hauling hay from a distant storehouse was enough to shake off the morning's chill. Even in regions without domesticated animals, winter brought its own active demands, checking traps, seeking firewood, clearing paths through snow, and repairing any shelter damage caused by storms. In hunting cultures, winter hunts were often grueling journeys over cold, uneven ground. Hunters moved through forests, muffled in snow, or across frozen plains, tracking game whose movements grew cautious and deliberate in the scarcity of winter. The hunt was physically demanding. Snowshoes or skis were used in some regions to spread weight and allow for easier movement. But even with such tools, every step carried the weight of layered clothing, weapons, and provisions. The exertion generated warmth, but it came at a price of fatigue, so careful pacing was as important as the pursuit itself. Communal activities also played a role in generating heat. In villages and camps, people might gather for group work, pounding grain, stretching hides, or crafting tools, tasks that kept the hands and shoulders moving steadily. While some work could be done seated by the fire, others required standing, bending, and lifting, allowing warmth to build through the day. In many cultures, songs or chants accompanied such work, their rhythms matching the movements of many arms working in unison. The music lifted spirits, and the shared motion kept everyone warmer. Children, in their own way, became small engines of warmth, though the elders might caution them not to stray too far into the cold. Games in the snow or races between houses filled the air with laughter and the sound of running feet. The young learned quickly that stillness meant shivering, while movement meant comfort. In some regions, children were even given small chores designed as much to keep them active as to aid the household, fetching snow for melting, carrying bundles of kindling, or stamping paths flat between shelters. Not all movement was work. In some traditions, winter gatherings included dances around the fire, both as celebration and as a way to stir warmth in the limbs. Slow, steady steps, clapping hands, and swinging arms kept the cold at bay as much as they brought joy. In other places, storytelling circles were punctuated with moments where listeners stood to stretch, stamp their feet, or join in a shared gesture before settling back down. Travel itself was an act of survival-driven motion. Families or individuals might need to move between seasonal shelters, bringing them across snowy ground or frozen rivers. Such journeys were made carefully, with frequent stops to rest and warm the body with food or drink. Each step was a negotiation, with the cold too slow and the chill could creep in. Too fast, and exhaustion would sap strength needed for the long trek ahead. For those living in coastal or riverine areas, winter fishing was another source of movement and heat. Cutting holes in the ice, hauling nets, or pulling lines required constant effort, and the body, working hard against the biting air, would find a temporary comfort in the labor. Even returning to the shelter with the catch, hands stiff from the cold, the warmth from exertion lingered for a time. The wisdom of movement was passed down through generations. Do not let the cold catch you sitting too long. Rise often, shift your limbs, and keep the blood flowing. In the deepest winter, when the fire's heat could not reach every corner of the home and the night seemed endless, it was often this advice that kept people alive. Motion became an unspoken agreement between the body and the world outside. You keep moving, I will keep you warm. And so winter life was not the frozen stillness it might have seemed from afar. Beneath the white quiet of the season, there was always motion, measured, deliberate, sometimes joyous, sometimes weary, but always necessary. Through this rhythm of movement, ancient people found not only survival, but a way to meet the cold on their own terms, step by step, breath by breath. In the cold season, food was more than nourishment, it was the slow-burning fuel that kept the inner fire alive. Without it, even the warmest shelter and the thickest furs would fail, for hunger could hollow out a body faster than frost could freeze it. Ancient people, living in a world where each winter's arrival was certain, but its severity uncertain, learned to treat food as both a daily need and a treasure that had to last until the first green shoots of spring returned. The preparation for winter often began months in advance, long before the first snow fell. Autumn was the season of gathering, of storing, of transforming perishable goods into forms that could endure the long months ahead. Grains were threshed, dried, and sealed in clay jars or woven baskets lined with hides. Meat was sliced into thin strips for drying or smoking. Fruits and berries were sun-dried or packed into clay pots with honey, and fish were preserved in salt where salt was available. The goal was always the same: to make the harvest last, to turn the fleeting abundance of summer and autumn into something that could be eaten in the hungry days of February. Cold itself could be a friend in preservation. In climates where winter temperatures stayed below freezing, nature provided vast and silent ice houses. Meat could be stored outdoors, hung high to keep it away from scavengers, or buried beneath snow and ice to keep it from spoiling. In some, cultures, people dug pits into frozen ground, lined them with straw or leaves, and stored sacks of roots or barrels of fermented vegetables within. These pits became pockets of security beneath the SNOWDRIFTS. Smoking meat was one of the most common preservation methods in ancient times. A low, steady fire smoldering more than burning would fill a small hut or covered frame with smoke that seeped deep into the fibers of the meat. This smoke not only flavored the food, but kept insects and decay at bay. In winter, smoked meat was prized for its durability, and a bundle of it hanging from the rafters was a visible sign of foresight and security. The scent of smoke and meat became one of winter's most comforting aromas, mingling with the tang of cold air each time the door opened. Fermentation, too, had its place in the winter table. In regions with access to cabbage or other leafy greens, sauerkraut-like preparations were made, using salt and thyme to transform vegetables into something that could last for months. Fermented dairy products like yogurt or kefir developed. In colder highland regions, offering a way to store milk long after fresh grazing was impossible. Even in the Arctic, fermented fish or meat buried in the ground and allowed to age was consumed, its sharp flavor a reminder of ancient traditions and acquired tastes. For the day-to-day winter meals, fireside cooking was both necessity and ritual. A pot of stew could simmer for hours or even days, with meat, grains, and roots added as they became available. The slow heat softened the toughest cuts and brought warmth not just to the stomach, but to the entire dwelling. A stew pot often became the heart of the household, each ladleful carrying the flavors of the past week's additions. Bread, when available, was baked in clay ovens or on heated stones, the smell filling the home with a reminder of the harvest. Hunting and fishing did not stop entirely in winter, though they became more dangerous and required greater skill. Ice fishing was practiced where rivers and lakes froze solid, requiring holes to be cut through thick ice. Nets and spears were used with care, and the catches were often eaten fresh to break the monotony of stored food. Hunters tracked animals, whose coats blended into the snow, following faint trails, until they could bring back fresh meat to supplement the stores. Such successful hunts were cause for quiet celebration, for they meant more variety and strength in the days ahead. Food distribution in winter was often communal, especially in small settlements or tight-knit family groups. A large smoked haunch might be shared at midwinter gatherings, when music and stories filled the night. Preserved berries might be brought out as a sweet luxury bright against the white landscape outside. These moments were not merely about sustenance, they were about memory, community, and the shared act of enduring winter together. Even the way food was eaten took on special care in the cold months. The body's need for warmth meant that hot food and drink were especially valued. Broths and herbal teas, made from dried leaves or bark stored since summer, soothed the throat and warmed the hands. In some traditions, a hot stone was dropped into a cup or small pot of liquid to heat it quickly when a fire was not already burning high. Not all food survived winter storage without risk. Mice, insects, and moisture could destroy months of preparation in a single night. This made vigilance. Essential storage jars were checked regularly, smoked meats examined, dried grains aired out. The knowledge of which foods kept best in which places was passed down carefully, for an error could mean scarcity later. The sound of a knife cutting through a block of frozen meat, the sight of a smoked fish gleaming in the firelight, the smell of bread baking on a flat stone, these were the rhythms of survival in the coldest months. Winter food was not abundant, but it was steady, and it taught a truth that has outlasted millennia, that to endure the cold, one must not only find warmth, but also carry the memory of summer in every stored grain and preserved berry. Inside the safety of walls, whether they were of stone, timber, hide, or snow, the cold did not simply vanish. It lingered in corners, seeped through cracks, and curled along the floor like a silent animal. The fire, while central, could not always reach every part of the room with equal warmth, and so ancient people learned to warm their bodies directly, layer by layer, method by method. In these quiet acts of self-preservation, there was as much art as necessity, small choices that meant the difference between comfort and misery. During the long nights of winter, clothing was the first and most personal defense. For those who lived in places where winters were sharp, garments were often made from the skins and furs of animals that could themselves survive the cold. Deer hides, supple yet strong, were worn with the fur facing inward for softness and insulation. The thick pelts of wolf, bear, or reindeer could wrap around shoulders like heavy cloaks, trapping the heat generated by the wearer's own body. Layers were essential, one piece over another, each creating pockets where air could be warmed and held. Even the smallest gaps were closed with cords, belts, or stitching, for a loose seam was an invitation for the wind to slip in. Undergarments, though often simple, were highly valued. Soft inner layers made from woven plant fibers or finely scraped skins helped wick away moisture important, for damp clothing could chill the body faster than no clothing at all. In some places, dried grasses were used as padding between layers, acting as both insulation and cushion. Around the neck, scarves or fur wraps kept the pulse points warm, while hoods or hats made from animal fur protected ears and trapped heat rising from the head. Hands and feet, so quick to lose warmth, were given special attention. Mittens, often made from fur with the skin side outward, kept fingers together so they could share warmth. Boots were lined with moss, wool, or fur, and in some traditions, hot stones wrapped in cloth were placed inside them before wearing, offering a brief but welcome heat. Snowshoes or thick outer soles helped keep the feet away from the biting chill of frozen ground, and in extreme cold, layers of dried grass might be stuffed inside footwear to create a dry, insulating barrier. Inside the home, heat was sometimes stored and carried in simple ways. Stones heated in the fire could be wrapped in cloth or hides and placed near sleeping areas. Their warmth would last for hours, slowly radiating into the surrounding space. In some regions, hollow pottery vessels were used the same way, filled with hot water, sealed, and slipped under blankets. This not only warmed the bed, but also provided drinkable water when morning came, no longer frozen solid. Sleeping arrangements were often communal. Families, and sometimes even visitors or neighbors, in times of harsh storms, slept close together. Shared blankets or large fur coverings could hold the warmth of multiple bodies, the combined heat greater than any one person could generate alone. In certain cultures, beds were not individual, but long shared platforms, lined with mats, skins, and furs, where the night's breathing created a small, humid pocket of warmth that was carefully preserved until morning dawned in houses with central hearths. People often rearranged their sleeping spots as the cold deepened, pulling closer to the fire. Some even constructed low tent-like canopies over sleeping areas inside the larger home, trapping warmth in a smaller space, much like a hide tent in the open air. The scent of smoke, the muted crackle of the embers, and the soft rustle of blankets became part of the winter night's soundtrack. Warmth could also come from the ground itself, or rather from what was placed between the body and the ground. Thick layers of reeds, straw, or dried grasses provided insulation beneath sleeping furs, preventing the body's heat from sinking away into the cold earth. In regions with access to wool, thick felted mats served the same purpose. Even snow could be a helper in some cases in igloos and snow shelters. Raised sleeping platforms were carved from packed snow and then covered, keeping the sleeper above the colder air that settled in the lower part of the room. Food and drink played their role in keeping the body warm from within. Hot soups, thick stews, and warm herbal infusions were shared before bed, their heat lingering long after the last sip. In some places, stones heated in the fire were dropped into wooden or hide containers filled with water, creating steam and warmth that could be felt in both hands and breath. Eating a hearty meal before sleep meant the body would be busy generating heat as it digested, adding another layer of comfort against the night's chill. And then there was movement, not the hard labor of the day, but small, steady motions to stir the blood. Before settling down, some might walk a slow circle around the home, stretch their limbs, or softly stamp their feet. In the coldest moments, people would shift under their covers, turning from one side to the other, letting trapped warmth settle. And again around them, it was never just one thing that kept the cold away indoors. It was a weaving of many threads thick clothing, clever insulation, the steady warmth of stones, the shared breath of sleeping companions, and the gentle heat of a well-tended fire. In these ways, night after night, people in the ancient world kept their bodies warm, finding comfort, even when the wind's voice pressed against their walls, and the frost curled in patterns along the window covers in the stillness between waking and sleep. Wrapped in layers of fur and quiet, they might hear the wind sigh outside, but they would not feel its bite. Inside was warmth, and inside was rest. When the wind came down from the mountains like a silent blade, and the air itself seemed to harden into ice, walls and fire were not always enough. The true first line of defense for ancient people was not the home nor the hearth, but the clothing, wrapped directly around the body, a portable shelter, a second skin. In the cold, the art of layering was as vital as the art of fire-making, and every stitch, fold, and fastening was born from generations of trial and error in the face of frost. The earliest layers were always the closest to the skin, soft, pliable, and able to hold warmth without trapping too much moisture. In some places, this meant finely scraped animal hides, worked until they were supple enough to move with the body. In others, plant fibers were twisted and woven into loose undergarments, allowing air to move while still offering insulation. The trick was in balance. Too loose, and the wind would slip in. Too tight, and the body's own heat would sweat away. Chilling rather than warming dot over this came the heavier protections, the outer skins, the thick woven wool, the furs with their deep, insulating undercoats still intact. In northern lands, reindeer hides were a treasure, their hollow hairs trapping heat in a way unmatched by other materials. In coastal winters, seal and otter pelts served as near impermeable shields against wind and snow, their natural oils repelling moisture. The layering was not only about warmth, but about adaptability. One could remove a piece when working by the fire, or add more when stepping out into the storm. Clothing was shaped by movement as much as by temperature. Hunters and frozen, forests wore garments that allowed for silent steps, with fur turned inward for warmth and outward for camouflage. Herding peoples layered long cloaks over tunics, their hems weighted to resist sudden gusts. In regions where snow blinded the eyes, hoods were drawn deep and trimmed with fur, not merely for style, but to catch the moisture of breath and keep it from freezing on the skin. The sewing of these garments was its own quiet mastery. Needles, carved from bone or fashioned from fine metal, pierced hides and fabrics with the precision of habit. Threads came from sinew, twisted plant fibers, or thin strips of rawhide, each treated to resist snapping in the cold. Seams were often double-stitched or overlapped, preventing wind from finding its way through even the smallest gap. In the harshest climates, seams were sometimes sealed with animal fat or beeswax, a subtle barrier against melting snow and icy. Every culture had its own patterns, its own way of balancing function and comfort. In the icy plains, trousers were tucked into high boots lined with wool, sealing off the legs from drifting snow. In mountain valleys, tunics were belted close to the body, keeping heat from rising away. Scarves and wraps protected the neck and chin, places where warmth could escape quickly. And always the head was covered, whether with caps knit from thick yarn, hoods cut from hides, or layered cloth wound into snug protection. Clothing also carried memory. The fur cloak handed down from a grandmother to her granddaughter carried not just warmth, but the scent of the hearths it had sat beside, the faint trace of smoke from countless fires. The woven belt, dyed with plant pigments in deep reds and browns, bore the mark of the hands that made it. In the long nights, these garments were more than barriers against the cold. They were reminders of continuity, of the thread that bound past to present. In some homes, clothing itself was part of the communal warmth. Furs were laid out in sleeping. Areas spread over shared beds or hung along the walls to keep the cold from creeping in. Children were wrapped in spare cloaks when they slept, their faces barely visible beneath the folds. When travelers arrived from the cold, they would often be handed a fresh layer, a shawl or fur from the household store, a gesture of welcome as much as survival. Even the act of preparing clothing was a winter ritual. In the dim light of oil lamps, hands worked to soften hides, to mend tears, to stitch new layers from old. Conversations moved slowly in the rhythm of the work, and the steady sound of needle through fabric or hide was as much a part of the evening as the crackle of the fire. Here, practicality and care were woven together, each stitch a small promise that the cold could be endured. And so, when the snow lay deep and the stars burned cold in the sky, a person could step out into the vast winter wrapped in their own little fortress. Layer upon layer, memory upon memory, warmth upon warmth, the clothing of the ancients was not merely worn. It was inhabited, like a home built from the threads of the world itself. When winter nights stretched long and the sky pressed down with the weight of frost, warmth alone was not enough to keep the spirit steady. Darkness, vast and unbroken, carried its own chill, a quiet emptiness that could seep into the mind as deeply as cold into the bones. For ancient people, light was as much a shield against the shadow as fire was against the bitter air. The flicker of flame, the gentle gleam of embers, the warm halo cast upon walls and faces, these were not mere conveniences. They were part of survival, as essential to comfort as the walls themselves. The hearth was always the first and greatest source of light. When the day's work ended and the sun sank, the fire's glow filled the home, casting moving patterns across the walls. In a way, this dancing light became a silent storyteller, shadows shifting like waves, embers pulsing like the rhythm of breath. Even when the flames lowered to a bed of red coals, the dim light they gave was enough to guide hands, to keep the darkness at bay, to remind the heart that warmth was still close. Not every home could rely on open flame. In many places, lamps were fashioned from whatever materials were at hand. In coastal and riverine cultures, small clay or stone bowls were filled with animal fat or fish oil, a wick made of twisted plant fibers, or strands of moss drawing the fuel upward to burn with a slow, steady glow. The scent of these lamps, earthy and rich, mingled with the smell of smoke and wood, creating an atmosphere that felt both protective and deeply familiar. In colder regions, where blizzards could cut off movement entirely, such lamps were a lifeline. Their flames, carefully shielded from drafts, gave not only light, but also a small measure of heat. Oil lamps and Arctic shelters might be placed near sleeping areas, their faint warmth rising alongside the soft light to create a tiny island of comfort within the cold. Candles, though simple to us, were luxuries to many ancient people. Beeswax candles, in particular, were treasured for their clean, sweet scent and their bright, steady flame. In some villages they were saved for special gatherings or midwinter festivals, when the longest night was broken by circles of glowing light flickering on the faces of those gathered together. Tallow candles, more common, carried a smokier smell, yet still gave the gift of light where otherwise there would be none. The arrangement of light in a home was an art of both practicality and mood. A central fire gave broad illumination, but smaller lamps placed in alcoves or near workbenches allowed fine tasks to be done even after sunset, mending clothing, shaping tools, preparing food for the next day. Lamps hung on walls or suspended from rafters cast their light downward in a circle, creating pockets of brightness in a sea of shadow dot beyond the home. Light also guided movement in the night. Torches, made of bound sticks or bundles of reeds, soaked in pitch, were carried to and from storage pits, animal enclosures, or neighboring homes. Their flames, bright and restless in the wind, were both a comfort and a beacon, marking the path through snow or along icy tracks. There was also the subtle interplay between light and reflection. In some homes, polished metal, shells, or even smooth ice surfaces were placed to catch and spread the glow of the fire, multiplying the sense of brightness without using more fuel. In snowbound regions, even the walls outside could serve this purpose, moonlight and firelight bouncing off the white drifts, softening the darkness beyond the doorway. Light was woven into the rhythm of winter evenings. Meals were eaten by its glow, stories told around it, hands warmed in its reach. It was during these hours, with the cold pressing against the walls and the wind sweeping outside, that communities bound themselves together in the glow of shared space. Children learned the shapes of their elders' faces in this soft light, as much a part of memory as the sound of voices or the scent of food dot. And then there was the quiet magic of the last light before sleep, the moment when the final log was pushed into the embers, when the lamps were dimmed to a faint shimmer, when the shadows settled like a blanket across the room. This half-darkness, still touched with warmth, lulled the mind into rest. In that tender in-between, the home itself seemed to breathe, walls holding the day's heat, air carrying the last threads of fire's scent, light fading like a whispered good night dot outside. The night remained vast and cold. Stars pierced the deep sky. The snow gleamed faintly under the moon. But inside a glow lingered warm, soft, unhurried, reminding those who dwelt there that even in the coldest world, light could hold a circle of life. When winter pressed down on the land, the difference between life and death often came down to the walls and roofs that stood between a human body and the open air. Cold was not simply a sensation. It was an ever-present force that could seep into bones and steal away warmth faster than the body could make it. To survive, ancient people had to become architects of necessity, learning to shape whatever their surroundings offered into shelters that could keep the cold at bay. The type of shelter built depended almost entirely on the materials at hand. In forested regions, wood was the most obvious choice. Logs could be cut, shaped, and stacked horizontally, their ends interlocked in careful notches to keep them stable. Between these logs, cracks were stuffed with moss, clay, or a mixture of straw and mud, anything to keep the wind from finding its way inside. These log homes were often small and low-roofed to conserve heat. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke, resin, and damp wool. In places where wood was scarce, people turned to the earth itself. Turf huts, for example, were built by stacking thick, grassy sod in layers, sometimes over a frame of driftwood or bones. The living roots in the sod added insulation, and in the coldest weather, frost clung to the outer walls like a second skin. The interior, though dark and often cramped, was surprisingly warm once a fire burned steadily. Within in treeless tundra or polar regions, snow became both enemy and ally. Snow's layered structure trapped air, making it a natural insulator. Inuit and other Arctic peoples perfected the art of building igloos, domes of carefully cut snow blocks stacked in a spiral, each block angled inward to create a self-supporting structure. Inside, the temperature could rise well above freezing, a striking contrast to the bitter winds outside. Animal skins or snow-blocked tunnels sealed the entrance to keep cold air from rushing in. A single oil lamp, burning seal fat, could light and warm the space enough for sleeping, eating, and even storytelling. For nomadic peoples of the steppe, mobility was as important as warmth. Their homes had to be both sturdy and portable. The yurt round with a wooden lattice frame covered by felt was a masterpiece of engineering for such a life. The thick felt made from pressed sheep's wool held in heat while still allowing the structure to breathe, reducing moisture buildup inside. The central roof opening served as both a chimney for smoke and a place to let in pale winter light. When it was time to move on, the yurt could be dismantled and loaded onto pack animals in a matter of hours. Even in milder regions, winter called for adaptations. In ancient Mediterranean or Near Eastern areas, where stone was more common than wood, houses were often built partly underground, with only the upper walls above the surface. The earth around them acted as a natural insulator, keeping the cold out in winter and the heat out in summer. Such structures blurred the line between human space and the surrounding land, creating a kind of partnership with the earth itself. Heating these shelters was another art. Fires could not simply burn all day without. Thought fuel was too valuable to waste. In many cases, the hearth was placed in the center of the home so that heat could radiate outward evenly. Stones placed around the fire would absorb warmth and continue to give it off long after the flames had died down. In some areas, people built raised sleeping platforms or lofts above the hearth. using the fact that warm air rises to keep the sleeping area the warmest part of the home. The walls themselves told stories of adaptation. In some places, hides were hung from the inside to block drafts. In others, woven mats or reed panels served as additional insulation. Roofs were weighed down with sod or snow to keep them from lifting in fierce winds. Entrances were often designed to bend or twist before reaching the main living space, forming a kind of cold trap so that every time the door opened, the frigid air would not rush directly in. Life inside these shelters was intimate and communal. Families and at times entire extended kin groups might share a single room. The closeness of bodies, combined with the heat of the fire, added another layer of warmth that no wall or roof could replicate. By the flickering light of a lamp or fire, people worked on winter tasks, repairing clothing, carving tools, weaving baskets, telling stories that wove together memory and imagination. The home was not only a refuge from the cold, it was a place where culture, language, and tradition were preserved during the long, dark months. The relationship between people and their shelters was deeply personal. A home was not just a structure, it was a shield, a womb, and at times a final defense against the unforgiving world outside. To leave it in the dead of winter was to step into danger. To return was to step into safety. Every layer of sod, every stone in a wall, every stitch in a felt covering was an act of care, placed there by hands that understood the stakes of survival. In time, some of these ancient designs became cultural signatures. Even as technology advanced and new materials became available, the old winter shelters, igloos, yurts, turf houses, log cabins remained symbols of resilience. They reminded people that for all the challenges of winter, humans had always found ways to meet the cold with ingenuity and determination. The cold might shape the land, but people could shape their response to it. In the long silence of winter nights, a home was more than walls and a roof. It was a barrier against the ceaseless whisper of the wind and the relentless drift of snow. In the ancient world, keeping that barrier strong was a constant work, not a one-time act. Snow fell not just in beauty, but with weight. Wind blew not just in passing, but with the strength to pry apart the smallest gaps in wood, stone, or hide. The cold was patient, pressing in from every side, and so people had to be patient too, finding ways to keep it out day after day, night after night. Before the snow came, the work began. Walls were checked for gaps where the wind might slip through. In timber houses, fresh clay or mud was pressed into the spaces between logs, sealing them as tightly as possible. In stone dwellings, moss or straw mixed with mud filled the cracks, the fibers adding strength to the seal. In hide tents, the seams were inspected and patched, often with additional strips of leather stitched carefully in place. Every hole, no matter how small, could become a channel for cold air to enter, and so attention to detail was not just useful, it was survival. Roofs demanded their own kind of care. A thatched roof could shed rain in summer, but snow in winter. was heavier and slower to melt. If the roof was too flat, snow would gather in thick, pressing layers, threatening to cave it in. This is why many cold region dwellings had steeply sloped roofs, angles sharp enough to let snow slide off under its own weight. Where steep slopes were not possible, people climbed up after storms with wooden shovels, pushing snow down to the ground, careful not to damage the roof itself. In some cases, snow was even allowed to build up deliberately along the sides of the house, where its packed layers acted as natural insulation against the wind. Doorways were perhaps the most vulnerable part of any shelter. Every time the door opened, heat spilled out into the cold, and cold rushed in to replace it. To limit this, some communities built double-door entrances, small enclosed spaces between the outdoors and the main living area, where one door could be closed before the other was opened. In simpler homes, thick animal skins were hung over doorways inside, acting as flexible barriers to slow the loss of warmth. Windows, where they existed, were rarely left open in the heart of winter. In some cases, thin sheets of horn or oiled animal bladder were stretched over wooden frames, letting in a softened light while blocking the wind. More often, windows were entirely sealed during the coldest months, the home lit by firelight instead of the pale sun. This darkness was accepted as part of winter life. Light could be given up, but heat could not. The hearth, the heart of the home, needed protection too. The chimney or smoke hole, while essential for letting smoke escape, could also let in cold air if left unguarded. In some traditions, a flap of hide or woven mat could be drawn across the opening in severe weather, adjusted carefully so that smoke still escaped without letting the wind bite too deeply into the room. In igloos, a low entrance tunnel prevented direct gusts from reaching the sleeping space, and body heat was kept close to the snow walls, which reflected it inward. Inside the home, insulation was more than just a roof over the head. Floors were layered with reeds, rushes, or woven mats, over which hides or thick cloth could be spread. Sleeping areas were often raised slightly off the ground, where air was warmer and dampness less of a problem. Some households created low partitions around sleeping spaces, trapping warmth from bodies and fires in a smaller volume, easier to heat than the full expanse of the home. In certain regions, the house itself was partly underground, built into the earth for protection. The soil and rock acted as a constant insulator, holding back the sharpest edge of the wind and the deep bite of the cold. These semi-subterranean homes had entrances that dipped downward before rising again into the living space, creating a cold trap where chilled air would sink before it could enter the main room. Storm preparation was not a one-time ritual, but a continuous rhythm. After each snowfall, paths to the woodpile, water source, or animal shelters were cleared, the walls brushed free of drifting snow to prevent moisture damage. The wind's direction was always noted, and if it shifted, the home might be reinforced again on a different side. The smell of freshly packed mud, the sound of leather being stitched, The sight of snow piled neatly away from the doorway, these were the quiet signs of a household ready for another night. Even with all these protections, there were times when the cold pressed in more strongly than usual, when storms howled for days, when frost crept inside along the walls, when the fire seemed smaller against the dark. In those moments, people would gather closer together, not just for warmth, but for reassurance. The walls might shake, the roof might groan under the snow's weight, but inside there would be a circle of light. The fire's warmth held in by every barrier they had built, every repair made in summer and autumn, every layer of care that turned a structure into a home. But it was in these moments, with wind screaming outside and silence inside, that the work of protection proved itself. The hearth stayed alight, the air remained bearable, and the people inside could sleep, knowing that the night would pass and the snow would stop, and their home would still be standing when the sun returned. Cold can creep into the human body in silence, and once it takes hold, it is not easily driven out. In ancient winters, where frost lay on every branch and the wind sliced through the air like a blade, keeping the body warm was a task of constant vigilance. Fire might heat the shelter, but clothing was the portable hearth, the second skin that allowed people to move, to hunt, to work, and to live beyond the reach of the home's walls. The art of making warm clothing began with observation. Long before there were needles or woven cloth, people noticed which animals fared best in the cold. The thick pelts of wolves, the layered coats of deer, the dense fur of beavers, the oily feathers of seabirds, these became the first teachers. When an animal was hunted, its meat fed the people, its bones became tools, and its hide or fur became protection against the winter's grasp. The earliest garments were likely little more than hides draped over the shoulders, fastened with a thong or bone pin. But with time came refinement. Skins were scraped clean of flesh and fat, then worked until supple. In colder regions, the fur was left facing inward for direct warmth against the body. The hides could be sewn together using sinew thread and bone needles, a skill that left behind archaeological traces so fine that they tell us these garments were not crude improvisations, but deliberate and skilled creations. Layering was another discovery born of necessity. A single hide could block the wind, but two layers, especially with air trapped between them, offered far greater warmth. In some regions, inner layers were made from softer furs like rabbit or hare, prized for their comfort, while outer layers came from tougher, weather-resistant hides such as reindeer or seal. The layering principle was instinctive. Long before the science of insulation was understood, air itself became the hidden ally, trapped between the fibers, slowing the escape of body heat. In places where weaving developed, wool emerged as a winter treasure. Sheep and goats were not only a source of meat and milk, their fleeces could be spun into threads and woven into thick, durable cloth. Wool's natural crimp held warmth even when damp, a property that made it invaluable in wet, cold climates. A simple rectangle of wool could be wrapped and pinned into a cloak, or sewn into tunics and leggings. Over time, people dyed wool in earthy reds, deep browns, and muted yellows, not for fashion alone, but because colors could lift spirits in. The gray of winter feathers and down were another gift of the natural world. Waterfowl, such as ducks and geese, carried an inner layer of soft down beneath their outer feathers, creating insulation so light and effective that even the coldest winds could not pierce it. Ancient people in northern wetlands gathered these feathers carefully, sometimes from nests, sometimes from hunted birds, and sewed them into cloaks or lined sleeping robes. A down-filled garment was like carrying a pocket of summer warmth through a heart of winter. Beyond the choice of materials, clothing design mattered greatly. In the cold, it is the extremities, the fingers, toes, ears, and nose that lose heat fastest. Ancient winter clothing almost always included mittens or gloves, fur-lined boots, and head coverings. Mittens, though they reduced dexterity, were warmer than gloves because they allowed fingers to share heat. Boots were often made with fur inside and leather outside, with the seams turned outward to prevent rubbing against the skin. In the Arctic, waterproof outer boots made from sealskin could be worn over inner fur boots, creating a double barrier against snow and ice. Head coverings varied with culture and available materials. In some regions, fur hoods were sewn directly onto cloaks, forming an unbroken shell of warmth. Elsewhere, thick felt hats, woven wool caps, or even simple wrappings of cloth served the purpose. The lesson was universal: lose heat from the head, and the whole body suffers. Decoration and symbolism found their way into winter clothing as well. Patterns stitched into a fur trim, colored bands woven into a wool cloak, beads or carved bone toggles. These were not only beautiful, but often carried meaning. A pattern might signify the maker's family, mark the garment as a gift, or call upon spirits for protection during dangerous journeys. Thus, clothing became not just a shield against the cold, but a canvas for identity and tradition. Caring for these garments was part of survival. Furs had to be kept dry to prevent rot. Wool could be cleaned with snow, brushed and aired out. In the cold, in some cultures, garments were smoked over low fires, which both preserved the fibers and left them infused with the scent of wood smoke, a smell that, for many, meant safety and warmth. Repair was constant. A winter coat might serve for many seasons, patched and reinforced, until it carried the memory of years. In the deepest winters, people even slept in their outer garments, wrapping themselves in furs or wool cloaks before lying down beside the fire. A well-made winter outfit was more than clothing. It was a portable home, a moving shelter that could accompany its wearer across frozen fields, icy rivers, and snow-swept plains. It allowed hunters to wait silently for game, traders to cross long distances, and children to play in the snow without the deadly chill reaching their bones. In the end, the story of ancient winter clothing is a story of resourcefulness and respect for the natural world. Every stitch, every seam was a reminder that survival depended on knowing the land and its creatures, and on using that knowledge with skill. In the cold, one could not afford to be careless. A missing mitten, a poorly sewn boot, or a torn cloak could mean frostbite or worse. But in the care of skilled hands, hides, furs, wool, feathers, and woven fibers became more than materials. They became a second skin, one that turned the cold from a predator into merely a presence and allowed human life to move through the winter unbroken. In the ancient world, cold weather was not merely an inconvenience, it was a daily negotiation with survival. A human body could be wrapped in fur and hide, hands could be kept warm in thick mittens, but without food, no amount of clothing or shelter could sustain life for long. And yet, in the frozen months, food was perhaps the hardest thing to find, prepare, and preserve. The earth gave little. Plants withered, rivers and lakes locked under ice. Hunting became both more dangerous and more necessary. To live through the cold, ancient people had to become masters not only of finding food, but of keeping it edible for weeks or even months. Preparation for winter often began in the seasons when the land was still generous. In late summer and early autumn, families and entire communities worked together to gather what could be stored. Grains, if they were grown, were dried and stored in tightly sealed containers, sometimes baskets lined with clay, sometimes leather, bags, and in some places clay jars buried partly underground to keep their contents at a steady, cool temperature. Fruits and berries were laid out in the sun or near the hearth to dry, their sweetness concentrated into small, long-lasting morsels that could be chewed slowly on the coldest days. Nuts, rich in fat and protein, were gathered in great quantities, for they could last through winter without spoiling. Meat was another matter entirely. In colder regions, meat preservation was both easier and more vital. Hunters took advantage of the cold itself, hanging large cuts outdoors to freeze naturally. In places where the air was dry, meat could be sliced thin and dried into jerky, sometimes smoked over a slow fire to add both flavor and longevity. Smoking also acted as a deterrent to pests, though in deep winter, insects were less of a problem. Fish were treated similarly, caught in abundance during the last days of open water, then gutted, cleaned, and dried or smoked for the months ahead. Salt, where available, was a miracle of preservation. Some coastal peoples harvested it from seawater by evaporation during the warmer months, creating stores that could be used to cure meat and fish, making them safe to eat for long stretches of time. For those far from the sea, salt was a precious trade item, worth more than many tools or ornaments. Without it, food preservation relied on drying, freezing, or storing in cold cellars dug into the earth. Cooking in winter required its own adjustments. Fire was a necessity, not only for warmth but for making food edible and safe. Yet firewood could not be wasted. Many meals were prepared in a single pot over a slow, steady fire, soups and stews that could feed multiple people and keep warm for hours. Such dishes made the most of whatever was available: chunks of meat, handfuls of dried vegetables, crushed grains, and sometimes herbs that had been gathered and dried in summer. The longer these stews simmered, the more their flavors deepened, and the more they could warm the body from the inside out in some traditions. Food was cooked in heated stones buried in pits, a method that conserved fuel and held warmth long enough to prepare large quantities of food at once. In Arctic and subarctic regions where wood was scarce, fires were often small, and cooking relied on the careful use of seal oil or whale blubber as both heat and light sources. Every scrap of fuel was precious, and nothing was wasted. The act of eating in winter was often a communal affair. In the dark months, people gathered close to the fire, sharing bowls or tearing pieces from a single loaf of bread like flatcakes, baked on hot stones. Stories were told as the steam rose from the food, a way to pass the time and to keep spirits warm. Children learned by watching how food was portioned, how the strongest hunters were fed enough to keep hunting, and how the smallest mouths were given the softest, warmest bits. Survival depended not only on having food, but on distributing it wisely. There was also a spiritual element to winter food traditions. Many cultures saw the preservation and sharing of food as an act of gratitude toward nature or the spirits of animals. Before a hunt, offerings might be left or words spoken to honor the life that would be taken. The first bite of a meal might be placed into the fire or onto the ground as a gift to unseen forces. These rituals helped remind people that survival was a shared effort between the human community and the world around them. In the coldest periods, when storms raged and travel was impossible, stored food was the difference between comfort and danger. Every carefully dried strip of meat, every jar of berries, every bag of grain represented hours of labor and foresight. When the wind howled outside and snow drifted high against the walls, a pot of stew on the hearth was more than sustenance. It was proof that the community had prepared, worked, and endured together. And always there was the awareness that winter was not eternal. Each meal eaten by the fire was a step closer to the return of green leaves and flowing water. Each bite of dried summer fruit carried the memory of warm days, and each piece of smoked fish reminded the eater of open seas and bright skies. Food was survival, yes, but it was also hope made tangible. In the coldest corners of the ancient world, before the hum of electric heaters and the luxury of insulated homes, warmth began not with the hearth but with the body itself. The fire might warm the air, but the body had to carry its own shield against the frost, and so, long before written history, people learned to wrap themselves in the gifts of the animals they hunted and the fibers they gathered. Clothing was not yet fashion, it was survival stitched into shape. When the first frosts of the season crept across the land, people would reach for garments stored away since the previous winter. These were precious items, often patched many times over, softened by years of wear and the warmth of countless nights. The most common materials in the deep past were hides and furs, taken from animals whose flesh had fed the family. The fur was left on the skin, forming a natural barrier against the wind, while hides could be scraped clean, softened, and worked into pliable leather. The process of preparing such clothing was as vital as hunting itself. Once an animal was skinned, the hide would be stretched, scraped of fat and sinew, then treated with natural agents, sometimes the animal's own brain, sometimes smoke, sometimes plant oils to prevent stiffening. The result was a supple leather that could bend and flex without cracking, perfect for wrapping around arms, legs, and torso. Women and men alike took part in this work, their hands roughened by cold water, stone tools, and long hours dot in many regions. Layers were the key to warmth. A thick fur cloak could be heavy, but underneath it, smaller garments made from softer skins or woven plant fibers helped trap body heat. In places where weaving developed early, strips of flax, hemp, or nettle fibers could be twisted into thread, then woven into coarse cloth. Though far less insulating than fur, these plant-based layers absorbed less moisture from sweat and snow, and so were valuable under heavier outerwear. Hoods and head coverings were essential for much of the bodies. Heat could be lost through the scalp. In the far north, hoods were sometimes lined with the soft down of birds, a rare and carefully saved material. Mittens, too, were common, for keeping the fingers together in a shared pocket of warmth made them far less likely to stiffen in the cold. Boots were made from layers of hide or fur sewn together with sinew, sometimes stuffed with dry grass or moss to add insulation and absorb moisture. Snow itself shaped clothing design. In places where people walked long distances over frozen landscapes, garments had to be made with flaps and closures that kept snow from sifting inside. Long tunics overlapped at the waist, leggings tied close at the ankle, and boots rose higher up the shin. The outside of winter wear was often oiled or smoked to resist moisture, for wet clothing in freezing weather was a danger as deadly as hunger. Decorations were not absent from these garments. Even in the harshest times, people found ways to make beauty from necessity. Edges might be trimmed with contrasting fur, seams stitched with brightly dyed sinew, or beads sewn into patterns along a collar. Such details were more than vanity. They spoke of identity, of belonging to a certain family, group, or tradition. In this way, winter clothing was also a story worn upon the skin. Some cultures developed specialized garments for particular tasks. Hunters venturing into deep snow wore lighter outer layers so they could move more quickly, relying on movement to generate heat. Those tending fires or working inside the shelter wore looser clothing that allowed them to sit and work without overheating. Clothing could be swapped or layered as needed, the same way one might adjust a fire's size to match the cold. Storage and care were ongoing challenges. When the spring thaw came, heavy furs had to be dried thoroughly and stored where insects or rot could not ruin them. Many were hung high in the shelter, safe from damp ground. Repairs were constant. Every small tear could grow under the strain of winter use, and so clothing was mended quickly, often by firelight in the quiet of evening dot. The making of winter garments was also a form of teaching. Older generations showed the younger how to cut and stitch hides, how to choose the right needle from bone or antler, how to thread sinew through thick layers without splitting them. These skills were as necessary as knowing how to hunt or fish, for a poorly made coat could be as fatal as an empty food store. To dress for winter was to armor oneself against nature's oldest challenge. Each garment was a shield, each stitch a defense, each layer a promise that the body would keep its warmth through another night. And when the wind howled outside the shelter, when frost feathered the edges of the doorway, people could draw their cloaks tight, pull their hoods low, and feel for a little while the quiet assurance of survival wrapped around them. Before the weaving of modern fabrics, before insulated jackets and thermal underwear, survival against winter's grip depended on the simple truth that clothing was not fashion, but armor. Ancient people understood that to walk into the cold without protection was to invite it into the very core of the body. It was not enough to be brave. Warmth had to be trapped and guarded layer upon layer, with the same care as a fire kept alive through the night dot in the most unforgiving climates. The starting point was fur, not tanned to smoothness, not stripped of its insulating guard hairs, but left as the animal had worn it, dense and warm. Caribou, reindeer, seal, and wolf fur had natural oils that repelled moisture, a gift against both snow and freezing rain. Hunters and gatherers wore these furs with the hair facing inward when deep cold demanded maximum warmth, trapping body heat close to the skin. At other times the fur faced outward to shed snow and ice before it could melt and chill the body. Leather, too, was a mainstay. Thick hides from deer, elk, or bison, softened and shaped to fit. While leather alone was less warm than fur, it could block the wind, making it an ideal outer layer. In many cultures, leather clothing was sewn with sinew thread, strong and resistant to breaking, even in freezing conditions. The stitches were tiny and tight, ensuring that cold air had no path to creep inside. Layering was as old as winter itself. Closest to the skin, people often wore softer furs, finely scraped hides, or plant-based fibers if they lived where flax or other stalks could be spun. Over that came heavier hides or woven cloth if available. The outermost garments were usually wind-proof thick fur, hide, or even layers of felt made from wool or animal hair pressed together with moisture and pressure. This system trapped pockets of warm air between layers, creating a barrier far more effective than any single piece could offer. Footwear was especially critical. In many regions, ancient people made boots from fur or hide, lined with moss, grass, or wool to wick away sweat and add insulation. The soles might be layered, with multiple hides for durability, sometimes stiffened with rawhide to handle icy ground. In Arctic traditions, boots called mukluks were sewn from sealskin, light and flexible yet warm, and could be stuffed with extra insulation for long journeys. Wet feet could mean frostbite in hours, so careful drying by the fire each night was part of the daily rhythm. Head coverings were equally important. Ancient wisdom knew that heat escaped quickly from the head, so hoods, caps, or fur-lined hats were common in all cold climate cultures. In places where wool was available, knitted or woven caps added warmth without bulk. Among northern peoples, hoods were often attached directly to cloaks or coats, forming a single piece that left no gap for the wind to exploit. Some had fur ruffs that helped trap warm air around the face and shielded eyes from blowing snow. Hands, too, needed protection, though mittens were far more common than gloves. A mitten kept fingers together, sharing their warmth, while gloves separated them and risked quicker cooling. Ancient mittens were sometimes made from 2 layers, a soft inner layer for insulation and a tough outer layer for durability. In certain traditions, mittens were tied to the sleeves with leather thongs so they could be removed without being lost, an important consideration when every piece of clothing represented hard labor and valuable materials. Decoration was not absent from these garments, but it was never purely for beauty. Beading, embroidery, or colored stitching could add charm, but it also often reinforced seams or added an extra layer of material over stress points. Patterns could identify a family group or serve as a record of hunts and travels, each stitch a story sewn into the very armor of winter life. Even the way clothing was worn mattered. Loose clothing let cold air circulate, while garments too tight could cut off circulation, leading to numbness and frostbite. The ideal was a snug but comfortable fit, with enough flexibility for movement. Hunters needed to be able to walk, kneel, and lift without tearing their clothing, and mothers needed freedom of movement to carry children wrapped against their chests or backs. Maintenance was constant work. Furs had to be dried carefully after snow or rain to prevent stiffness and rot. Hides needed to be oiled to stay supple, while wool had to be aired out and kept free from moisture. Many garments were patched dozens of times over their lifespan, the marks of repair adding to their story. In some traditions, the most experienced members of the community were those who could make the warmest and most durable clothing, a skill as valuable as hunting itself. Clothing was not just physical protection. It was a shield of familiarity in a landscape that could seem endless and hostile. A fur-lined hood could smell faintly of wood smoke, reminding its wearer of the firelight waiting at home. A cloak stitched by a loved one carried not only warmth, but a thread of connection, a reminder that the wearer was part of a circle of care and survival. In the quiet of a winter night, when the stars shone sharply in the cold air and the snow beneath one's feet squeaked with frost, the difference between comfort and danger often lay in the layers carefully wrapped around the body. In those garments, ancient people carried not only the warmth of their own bodies, but the memory of every winter their people had endured and the hope of every spring yet to come. In the long history of humankind, there have been few discoveries as vital as fire. And in the cold months of ancient winters, it was not simply a tool, it was the heart of life itself. For the people who lived in an age before stone houses, before iron stoves, before the steady hum of machines, fire was a living presence in the home. It was both fragile and enduring, needing care yet giving endlessly in return. Inside the winter shelter, the fire was almost never allowed to die. To let it go out was to invite hardship. Striking a flame in the dead of winter could be a laborious task, and in some cases, without flint or tinder, impossible. So someone always tended the embers. Through the day and through the long night, it was watched over, coaxed when it grew weak, fed when it burned low. The fire pit was usually placed at the very center of the living space, its position not only practical for heating, but symbolic. In many cultures, the fire was a shared heart around which the entire household revolved. The arrangement of life inside the shelter reflected the fire's importance. Around the hearth, people placed their tools, their food stores, their sleeping places, and their gatherings. The heat radiated outward, creating a circle of comfort in which work could be done and conversations could unfold. At the very edge of this warmth, the air grew cooler, until it finally merged with the frost that pressed in from outside. In this way, the fire marked the boundary between the world of safety and the world of cold. Fuel for the fire was gathered with diligence. In the coldest months, it was a daily necessity. Bundles of dry sticks, armfuls of branches, and heavier logs were stacked along the walls or under protective coverings outside. In some regions, peat or dried animal dung was used, pressed into bricks and stored for winter. Even the smallest scraps, twigs, bark, chips from woodworking were saved, for in a season where warmth meant life, nothing combustible was wasted. The act of tending the fire was not merely physical. It was often bound up in ritual and meaning. Among certain ancient peoples, the first spark of the winter season might be lit with solemn ceremony, and the hearth would be seen as a sacred space. Children might be told never to spit into the fire or to pass between the fire and the elders, as such acts were thought to offend the spirit that lived in the flames. Cooking, too, was shaped by winter's demands. In summer, food could be roasted quickly or eaten fresh, but in winter, slow simmering over steady embers became common. Soups and stews bubbled in clay or stone vessels, thick with roots, grains, and dried meat, sending fragrant steam into the air. This warmth filled the shelter, not only with heat, but with the sense of abundance, however modest. The scent of cooking mingled with the smell of smoke, fur, and wood-up perfume of survival. Fire also served as a source of light when the days were short. In the blackness of midwinter, the glow of the hearth was often the only illumination. Shadows danced on the walls, and faces shone with a gentle, flickering brightness. This light made winter nights feel less endless, creating a pocket of gold in a sea of dark blue and black at times. The fire offered more than warmth or light. It was a companion. On nights when wind screamed across the plains or snow buried the landscape in silence, The crackle of the fire became a voice in the stillness. People stared into the flames and saw stories, patterns, and even omens. In such moments, the fire was not just a tool of survival. It was the thread that stitched the human spirit to the heart of winter dot when dawn arrived. The embers might glow softly under a layer of ash, like small suns waiting to be reborn. A practiced hand could stir them into flame with a few dry twigs and a gentle breath. And so the cycle continued, day after day, night after night. The fire was kept alive, and in return, it kept the people alive. In this way, fire was more than a center of warmth, it was the center of the world. Everything in winter revolved around it. The meals, the work, the gatherings, the sleep. Without it, the cold would claim the land and the people. With it, life could not only endure, but even find moments of comfort and peace. In the heart of the deep freeze, the ancient fire burned on, a living memory of summer, hidden in the center of winter. Before the world was crisscrossed with paved streets and insulated houses, before glass windows could keep out the drafts, the battle against the cold began with the choice of where to sleep. In the ancient world, shelter was not only a place to rest, it was the very wall between life and death during the bitter months. The cold did not merely creep. It pushed its way into bones and breath, stealing warmth faster than the fire could make it. And so every culture that endured winter had its own solutions, shaped by the materials at hand and the wisdom passed down through the generations. In the northern reaches, where snow lay heavy and wind howled across open plains, people sometimes built shelters half buried into the ground. The earth itself was a blanket, holding a steadier temperature than the air above. These semi-subterranean homes were dug into hillsides or flat plains, their walls lined with stones, wood, or packed earth. Above them, roofs were made of heavy beams, covered in layers of sod, moss, and snow itself, because snow, paradoxically, could act as an insulator, trapping heat inside. Elsewhere, dense forests provided timber for cabins. Ancient log houses were far from the draft-free homes we know today, but they offered a significant barrier against wind and freezing rain. Gaps between logs were filled with moss, clay, or animal hair to keep out the chill. Inside, the hearth was central, not just physically, but socially. Around it, life unfolded. Cooking, mending clothes, teaching children, and telling stories that stretched across the long nights. The walls would darken from smoke, and the air would grow heavy with the scent of wood, fur, and stored food in treeless tundras and icy coasts. Ingenuity took another form. Shelters made from animal skins stretched over frames of bone or driftwood. Whale ribs, scavenged along the shoreline, could serve as sturdy arches. Caribou hides, thick with fur, were lashed together to create windproof barriers. Such tents were light enough to move when hunting demanded travel, yet heavy enough to keep out most of the cold if placed wisely, with the doorway away from the prevailing wind. Among certain Arctic peoples, snow itself became the building material. Compact snow, carefully cut and stacked into spirals, could form an igloo, its inside surprisingly warm once a small fire or even body heat began to build. The curved walls reflected heat downward, and the entrance tunnel trapped cold air outside. This was not a permanent home, but for hunters on long journeys, it was a miracle of practicality, built from the very element that threatened survival. The choice of site for a shelter was as important as its construction. A house on a hill might catch the morning sun, but it would also bear the full force of the wind. A valley might be sheltered, yet prone to frost pooling at night. Experienced builders knew to look for natural barriers, dense trees, large boulders, or ridges that could break the wind. They considered how the snow drifted, how water might run during thaw, and how close they could be to fuel for the fire. Inside these shelters, warmth was not just from the hearth, but from the way space was used. Sleeping areas were often raised slightly above the floor, keeping people out of the coldest air that settled near the ground. Beds might be lined with furs or layered with reeds, straw, or moss to insulate from below. In communal dwellings, people slept close together, sharing body heat under heavy coverings. Even animals might be brought inside during the worst storms, the breath of a goat or dog adding a little warmth to the enclosed space. Ventilation was a delicate balance. Too little, and smoke from the fire would sting eyes and choke the lungs. Too much, and the warmth would escape into the dark. Builders cut small vents high in the roof, or left gaps in walls that could be stuffed with cloth or moss as needed. In some places they used a double-layer wall, with an air gap between, allowing the inside to remain warmer than the outside without losing precious heat too quickly. Maintenance was constant. Snow might pile on the roof, and while it added insulation, it could also collapse a weak structure if not watched. Strong winds could pull hides from their lashings or send icy drafts through cracks. Ice itself could creep into the shelter, forming along beams and corners, and needed to be chipped away before it melted and refroze, widening the gaps. For many ancient people, winter shelter was not just about keeping warm, it was about creating a space where life could go on in the face of harshness. A good shelter allowed children to grow through the dark months, elders to pass on their knowledge, and the group to keep tools, food, and fire safe. The sound of the wind outside could be fierce, yet within those walls there might be quiet. Conversation, the scrape of a needle through hide, or the slow rhythm of someone grinding grain for morning dot. And in that warmth, no matter how thin, there was a sense of safety. The night might be long, the frost deep, but the people inside could listen to the winter's voice without fear, knowing they had built themselves a place the cold could not conquer. In the ancient world, before matches, lighters, or even the simple spark of flint and steel became commonplace, fire was not merely a convenience, it was life itself. To lose it in the depth of winter was to invite the cold into one's bones, into one's breath, until it claimed everything. The people of those early days did not think of fire as a tool, but as a living thing, a companion that needed feeding, tending, and careful protection. It was often said, though not in words we might write today, that a good fire could not simply be made, it had to be coaxed into existence, much like a child learning to stand. The first stage was always patience. Dry tinder was sought in the least likely of places, within the hollow of a dead tree, beneath the shelter of a fallen log, or inside the abandoned nest of a bird. In some lands the fluffy down of certain plants, soft as breath, was collected, and kept in small pouches made from animal hide. In wetter climates, thin curls of bark peeled from birch trees could be used, their oils catching flame even when damp. Kindling came next, slender sticks no thicker than a finger, gathered in careful bundles. Larger branches were split into smaller lengths to speed drying, for wet wood would smolder and smoke, but refuse to give heat. The fire-maker would kneel near the hearth space, his hand steady despite the cold. 2 sticks, one serving as a drill, and the other as a base, might be pressed together and spun until heat began to bloom in the dust between them. Or, if the group had carried embers from a previous camp, the work was gentler. Ash was brushed aside to reveal the faint red glow within, which was then fed with tinder until it leapt into light again. Once the first flame danced, the work was not over. It had only begun. The fire had to be arranged like a small dwelling of its own. The tinder and kindling were the floor, the mid-sized branches the walls, and the larger logs the roof. Air was the breath of the structure, and without it the flame would starve. But too much wind could scatter the embers, so stones were sometimes placed around the hearth, forming both a boundary and a store of heat that could radiate back into the shelter long after the flames dimmed. The fire's uses were many. It cooked the meat that would otherwise be tough or unsafe to eat. It boiled water to make it clean, releasing curls of steam into the dim air of the shelter. It smoked hides to make them more durable, keeping them from rotting in damp weather. And most importantly, in winter, it kept frost from settling on the sleeping forms of the people themselves. At night, the fire was banked, pushed together, and covered lightly with ash so it could smolder slowly until morning. This was not wasteful. It was wise. The effort to relight a fire from nothing could cost precious energy when the air outside was sharp enough to sting bare skin within seconds. The hearth was also the center of winter life. Around it, stories were told in quiet voices, their words curling into the smoke and vanishing into the rafters. Tools were repaired here, garments patched, and food shared. Children learned the rhythm of feeding the fire as naturally as they learned to walk, placing small sticks at the edges and watching them catch. To sit close to the fire was to feel a part of the group's shared strength. To sit far from it was to be reminded of the cold waiting just beyond the walls. The fire gave more than warmth. It gave light. On nights when the wind howled and snow fell in thick veils, the glow from the hearth was the only proof that the world beyond the walls still existed. The shadows it cast moved gently, swaying like living things, and the air seemed softer within its reach. Those who tended the fire were not just keeping the cold away, they were keeping the darkness from pressing too close. And so, the fire was treated with quiet reverence. It was never wasted, never left alone for long, and always given the best of what could be spared. In return, it became the heart of the shelter, the heart of the people, and the heart of survival itself. Before the rivers hardened under their winter skins and the earth locked its treasures away beneath frost, the ancient people turned their minds to the work of gathering. This was not hurried labor, but a long, steady rhythm, begun when the sun still carried warmth and completed only when the first real cold whispered through the grass. In those weeks of preparation, every able hand, young or old, had a role to play. The first task was to read the signs. Hunters would note the thinning coats of summer animals and the growing plumpness of their autumn forms. Gatherers would observe which berries had sweetened, which nuts had loosened in their shells, and which roots had fattened beneath the soil. There was a deep, quiet knowledge in these observations, a map of time drawn without ink or parchment. They knew that to wait too long was to risk the spoil of rot or the loss to early snow. To begin too soon was to waste the season's full gift dot in the forests. Long shadows stretched between the trunks as people moved in small groups, baskets in hand. They sought hazelnuts and acorns, the former prized for their sweetness, the latter for their ability to store long into the winter if leached of their bitterness. Children learned quickly to distinguish between safe and unsafe foods, their small fingers ideal for prying treasures from stubborn shells. In the meadows, others gathered late berries, dark and wrinkled, but still bursting with flavor when dried. Near the fire, the roots of cattails, heavy with starch, were dug from the banks of shallow streams, their fibers cleaned and set aside to be roasted or boiled later. Hunting, too, shifted in purpose as the cold approached. The goal was no longer only to feed the camp for the day, but to stockpile for the months ahead. Larger animals were taken when possible, not recklessly, but with the knowledge that a single reindeer or bison could feed many mouths and provide hides for clothing and shelter. The meat was sliced thin and laid across wooden frames above smoky fires, the steady heat and fragrant smoke preserving it for weeks, even months. Fish were split and hung in much the same way, their silver scales glinting in the dim light before, turning dull with the drying dot inside the shelters. The work continued. Dried berries were strung together with sinew, forming garlands that could be hung from the rafters. Nuts were cracked and stored in leather pouches. Roots and tubers were placed in earthen pits lined with dry leaves to keep them from freezing. Every item had its place, not only for neatness but for survival. Spoiled food could spread sickness, and a careless hand might spill what could not be replaced until the spring. Even with these preparations, there was an acceptance that winter would be lean. The ancient people knew hunger as an old acquaintance, one that might visit in the darkest weeks despite their best efforts. But they also knew the comfort of looking upon their stores and seeing the promise of many meals. The sight of hanging meats, baskets of nuts, and bundles of dried plants was more than a measure of wealth. It was a reassurance that, for a while, the cold could be met with full stomachs and warm fires. And so, with each passing day, the baskets emptied into the shelters and were sent out again. The air grew crisper, the sun sank lower, and the rhythm of gathering became as natural as breathing. It was not a race, but a steady march toward readiness. When at last the first true frost came, white and silent in the dawn, it found the people not surprised but prepared. For ancient people, winter clothing was not just protection. It was a home they could carry with them. The thick walls of a shelter might guard against the night, but the clothing kept them alive in the hours spent outside, moving through snow, tending animals, gathering fuel, or hunting in the frost. Every layer was chosen with purpose. The innermost garments were often soft hides worn close to the skin, their smooth surface keeping body heat near. Over this came heavier pelts, sometimes worn with the fur facing inward for warmth, and sometimes outward to shed snow. Around the waist, belts or braided cords tied the layers close, stopping drafts from creeping in. For those in the coldest lands, clothing was so well fitted and sealed that it trapped warm air like a skin of heat dot. The making of winter garments was an art passed down through countless generations. Women and skilled tailors shaped hides to fit the body, sewing them with sinew thread that swelled when damp, closing any gaps. The seams were sometimes reinforced with strips of fur, adding not only warmth but decoration. Even in the harshest months, people found ways to add beauty-colored beads, patterned stitching, or tassels swayed with each step, small signs of life against the white silence. Hoods were nearly always present, large enough to cover the head and shoulders, with fur ruffs that caught the air before it touched the skin. Hands were guarded in mittens of layered hide, sometimes with a separate inner glove that could be changed when damp. Footwear was treated with the same care, lined with grass or wool to keep the toes dry and wrapped in layers to fend off frostbite, snow, and ice could cling to clothing during long journeys. And so at day's end, garments were hung near the fire to dry, steaming softly as the heat chased away the damp. The scent of smoke would cling to every layer, a constant reminder of safety and hearth. In this way, the clothing itself became part of the person's life cared for, mended and cherished through many winters. And when sleep came, many people kept their clothing on, loosening belts, but never fully removing the layers. In the coldest places, undressing for bed was unthinkable. Instead, clothing merged with blankets until both were warmed by the body's heat. This was why winter garments were made with such precision. They had to be both armor for the day and comfort for the night. Through these clothes, ancient people walked through winter, not as guests in a hostile season, but as inhabitants dressed in homes they carried with them, ready to face the long cold. When the air grew sharp, and the breath of each living thing rose in pale clouds, water became both more precious and more difficult to claim. In the long warmth of summer, streams ran clear and plentiful, lakes offered open surfaces to cup in. The hands and rain could be caught from the roofs of hides. But in winter, water often hid itself, sealing away in layers of ice or vanishing into the frozen ground. To the ancient people, securing drinkable water was not a matter of convenience. It was an unbroken necessity, pursued with the same care as fire and food. The first defense against thirst in the cold season was planning. Before the ice thickened, water was stored in hollowed-out gourds, large animal bladders, or clay vessels. These were kept inside the shelter, close enough to the fire that they would not freeze solid, but far enough away to prevent the containers from cracking with sudden heat. In some regions where streams remained slow and shallow through autumn, trenches were dug from the water's edge, channeling a trickle into a small, sheltered pool that would freeze later and more thinly than the open current dot. Once the freeze came in earnest, the work changed. Ice itself could be gathered and melted, but this was never done carelessly. Melting took fuel, and fuel was life. Large chunks of river ice were broken with stone axes, carried back to camp, and left to soften near the fire before being placed in heated vessels. Snow, light and clean, was sometimes melted instead, but the people knew it gave far less water than ice and chilled the body when eaten raw. To survive, they learned to take snow only in small mouthfuls, letting it melt slowly to avoid stealing heat from within. In colder northern lands, holes were cut into the ice of rivers or lakes, a practice that required both skill and caution. A sharp-edged stone or bone chisel could chip away at the frozen surface until a dark circle of water appeared below. The opening was kept small to limit refreezing, and was often covered with a slab of bark or a hide when not in use. Here, fish could also be caught, making each trip to the water's edge a chance for both hydration and food. In places where winter was less severe but still biting, springs were the treasure of the land. Steam rising faintly from a patch of bare ground might reveal a warm water source, its flow continuing even when the nearby earth was hard as stone. Such places became gathering points not only for people but for animals, and were approached quietly and with watchful eyes. The work of obtaining water was constant. Even within the shelter, melted water was carefully rationed, its vessels sealed to keep out ash and dust. Children were taught to carry water in small skin pouches tied at the waist so that it was always near at hand. Washing was rare, reserved for wounds, illnesses, or the preparation of food. Cleanliness in winter was measured differently by the health of the body and the absence of sickness rather than by the brightness of skin or cloth. And yet, water carried more than survival. On certain still mornings when the air was calm and the frost lay thick over every branch, the people would watch the steam curl from their cooking pots and feel a quiet gratitude. The warmth in a wooden cup held between both hands was more than heat. It was a reminder that life, even in the season of ice, could still flow. When the sun slipped away early and the world outside the shelter turned to a deep, endless blue, The ancient people entered the season of long nights. Sleep became more than rest. It became a refuge, a way to pass the hours when cold pressed most heavily against the walls. In those months the rhythms of life bent to the cycle of darkness and light, with the body's warmth preserved most carefully in the hours of stillness. Inside the shelters, sleeping places were arranged with deliberate care. The ground was lined with layers of dried grass, reeds, or leaves to insulate against the cold earth. Over this, thick hides or fur pelts were laid, their softness trapping heat. In many homes, sleeping spots were built slightly above the ground, on low platforms made of wood or woven reeds, another barrier against the slow creep of cold from below. Where families were large, space was shared closely, the bodies pressed together beneath shared coverings so that each person's warmth flowed into the next. The hides used for sleeping were among the most valued possessions in winter. Thick bison robes lined with softer pelts like rabbit or fox were reserved for the youngest and the oldest who needed extra protection. Before night fell, these covers were shaken out near the fire, absorbing the day's heat before being spread over the sleepers. The scent of smoke and the fur became a familiar comfort, a signal that the day's work was done. Night itself was not always a single stretch of sleep. Many times the people would wake in the middle hours, tending to the fire, speaking in hushed voices, or simply sitting in the quiet glow of the embers before returning to their bedding. This first sleep and second sleep pattern matched the natural rhythm of the dark season, when the sun's absence could last so long that waking in the night felt as ordinary as waking at dawn. Children often slept in the innermost part of the shelter, protected from drafts by the bodies of adults. Those on the outer edges would pull their hoods over their heads, leaving only the tip of the nose exposed to the air. In the coldest nights, even the dogs, valued for both companionship and their ability to sense danger, would curl up against human legs, sharing warmth without invitation or complaint. Silence ruled the sleeping hours, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the soft shifting of bodies. Outside, the night wind might rise, hissing against the roof or rattling the shelter's frame, but inside the stillness was almost unbroken. Dreams in winter seemed different, slower, deeper, perhaps shaped by the dim and muffled world beyond the walls. Morning came quietly, without the bright rush of summer days. Often it arrived as a pale glow in the entrance, the fire already being stirred back to life. Breath hung in the air, and the bedding was reluctant to give up its heat. Yet in these long nights the people found their strength renewed. Sleep was not just the body's rest, but a shield and nightly retreat from the endless patience of winter. Long before the first snowflake of the season would drift down from the pale winter sky, ancient people understood that survival began with the walls around them, or, in many cases, the earth beneath them. Shelter was not merely a roof overhead. It was the skin of an extended body, holding in precious heat and keeping out the invisible teeth of the wind. Every choice of material, Every bend of a branch or stacking of stone was shaped not by beauty or ornament, but by the slow and careful language of necessity. In places where forests spread like a dark sea of trunks, wood was plentiful. Great lengths of fallen timber could be cut and shaped with stone axes, smoothed by repeated use and polished by the oils of human hands. A shelter here might rise like a dome of interwoven boughs, layered first with bark to keep out rain, and then with animal hides to trap warmth. The floor would be thick with reeds, leaves, or dry grass, forming a soft and insulating bed against the icy ground. Such homes were temporary and design-made to be abandoned and remade as hunting grounds shifted, but within them a small family could pass the deepest cold of night in relative comfort. In treeless plains, the logic of building was different. Without tall trunks to anchor a roof, the people turned to the earth itself, digging shallow pits into the ground. The low walls, naturally shielded from the wind, were then built up with turf blocks cut from the grassy surface. These sod bricks, damp and heavy at first, would dry into firm layers that could hold the weight of a hide-covered roof. Inside, the air would be still, the sounds of the outside world muffled, and a fire's warmth would pool in the pit like water in a basin. Further north, where winters bit harder and longer, stone became the main ally. Here the wind could strip heat from a body in moments, and a single unprotected night might mean death. The shelters in these places were squat, solid, and almost featureless from the outside. Large stones were carefully stacked, leaving only a narrow entrance that could be blocked with a thick hide or woven mat. The roofs might be built of overlapping slabs or of bones from great animals, mammoth ribs, perhaps covered with layers of sod and hide. These homes were not beautiful, at least in the way we might think of beauty, but there was an unspoken elegance in their endurance. A well-built stone shelter could last through many seasons, becoming a familiar refuge for generations. Every part of a shelter was chosen with purpose. Openings were few, not because light was unimportant, but because each gap was a place for heat to slip away. Fires were set not in the middle of a room, as in many later homes, but often toward one side, where smoke could escape through a narrow vent without letting in too much cold air. The ground near the fire would be reserved for those who needed warmth, most the very young, the elderly, or those recovering from illness. Sleeping places were arranged in layers, with bodies close together, hides thrown over them like shared skin. But a shelter was more than a structure. It was also a place of sound, the muffled crack of a log breaking in the fire, the faint hiss of snow hitting a hide roof, the low, steady breathing of those asleep. These sounds became the heartbeat of winter life. Even without words, they told the listener, "You are inside. You are safe. You are warm enough for now." Outside, the world might be a frozen expanse, the wind turning ridges of snow into pale dunes, but inside, time slowed. A child might trace patterns in the frost forming on the edges of the hide walls. An elder might work quietly at a bone needle, sewing together fur garments while the fire flickered. The walls would hold in not just warmth, but the scent of smoke, the musk of hides, and the faint sweetness of drying meat aromas that, to these people, were the smell of survival. And always, in the back of every mind, was the knowledge that the shelter was only as strong as the care given to it. Each day, cracks in the walls were patched, snow was brushed from the roof, hides were adjusted to block new drafts. For winter was patient, and it would seek out every weakness. But with patience of their own, the people could match it. By the time the true heart of winter arrived, these shelters had become more than homes. They were small islands of life, glowing softly in the frozen sea of the world. They were the difference between enduring the season and being claimed by it. Long before the deep cold of winter wrapped itself around the ancient world, the people understood that shelter alone was not enough. Warmth had to be carried with them, woven, stitched, and layered onto their bodies like a second skin. In this quiet struggle against the cold, clothing became more than protection. It became a kind of portable home, an unbroken barrier between flesh and frost. The earliest winter garments were not delicate or decorative. They were shaped by necessity, by the simple truth that exposed skin lost heat too quickly to survive. And a long winter night, animal hides with fur left on were the first line of defense. A deer taken in the autumn could provide both food and a coat that might last until the spring thaw. Hunters knew to choose animals whose winter coats had grown thick and long, for the fur itself was nature's finest insulation. After the hide was removed, it was scraped clean with stone tools, the edges smoothed to prevent pearling, and then softened with a mixture of animal fat and bone dust. This work was slow, done by steady hands, often in the dim light near a fire. The hides, once treated, became supple enough to wrap around the body without cracking in the cold. Layering was instinctive. A softer inner lining, perhaps from rabbit fur, would rest against the skin, while heavier, coarser hides formed the outer layer. Around the legs, strips of hide or woven reeds could be wrapped tightly, secured with leather cords. The feet were the most delicate part to protect. Simple shoes might be made from a single piece of hide, pulled up around the ankle and tied with sinew. Inside these shoes, dried grass or moss was packed for extra insulation, absorbing sweat and keeping the skin dry, for dampness was an enemy in the cold. In regions where hunting yielded large animals, such as reindeer or bison, the people could make full-body coverings. These garments, stitched together with bone needles and sinew thread, formed a kind of hide suit hood included that allowed the wearer to travel long distances in deep snow without the bite of wind on the skin. In wind-swept plains, hoods and cloaks were often edged with extra fur to trap the warm air around the face. In forested lands, where branches dripped with frost and snow, cloaks could be thrown back easily when near the fire, preventing overheating. And dampness, decoration was rare, though not absent. Some groups added small beads of bone or carved ivory along the seams. not for vanity, but to mark the work of a skilled hand or to carry a story. In certain places, red ochre was rubbed into the seams, sealing them against moisture, while adding a subtle earthy color. These details were quiet acts of expression, reminders that even in the hardest months, beauty could survive. Clothing was also a sign of care within a community. Children outgrew their garments quickly, so the hides were repurposed, cut down, or patched from other pieces. Elders, often less able to hunt, received extra layers, their cloaks lined more heavily, their feet given the warmest shoes. A hunter returning from a long journey might offer a particularly fine hide to a family member who had stayed behind, a gift that was as valuable as food. In the coldest months, garments were never left far from the body. At night, clothing might be kept under the covers of fur and hide to prevent it from freezing stiff. A morning ritual often began with rubbing the outer layers between the hands, warming the leather before venturing outside. The smell of these garments, smoke from the fire, faint musk of the animal, traces of pine or earth became part of the identity of the wearer. In this way, clothing was not just an object. It was a constant companion, a silent partner in the pact between humankind and winter. The people wore their survival draped over their shoulders, wrapped around their legs, and tied at their waists. And when the wind rose, when snow fell in sheets across the open land, they could step outside their shelters and know they carried with them the same warmth they had within their walls.